Welcome to A Real Affliction, BPD Culture and Stigma, a podcast devoted to exploring how we experience, treat, write about, advocate for, and conceptualize borderline personality disorder. My name is Cynthia Gralla. I'm a writer and teacher with a history of BPD. Trigger warning, this episode will discuss suicide and self-harm. Since I contributed a short story to an anthology of speculative fiction about reproductive rights in 2023, I've wondered what speculative fiction about BPD would look like. So I was overjoyed to discover Mishell Baker's Arcadia Project novels, whose protagonist is Millicent Roper, a double amputee with BPD who is adjusting to the physical disability that resulted from a suicide attempt. This urban fantasy trilogy manages to explore the hard battle and hard truth of the BPD experience while still being loads of fun to read. Borderline is the first book in the trilogy, and it's followed by Phantom Pains and Imposter Syndrome. They're set in LA, where Mishell lives, and specifically in Hollywood, in which she's worked. In this series, among other marvels, Hollywood royalty find their muses through fairy soulmates who cross over from a parallel world. The books have been shortlisted for a Nebula Award, one of the most prestigious awards for speculative fiction, along with the World Fantasy, Tiptree, and Mythopoeic Awards. And no wonder, they're smart, funny, and whimsical. And they contain the most convincing representation of BPD that I've seen in fiction so far. Mishell has a knack for concretizing concepts like trauma and inspiration. In Do Metaphors Dream of Literal Sleep, a science-fictional theory of representation, So-Young J. Chu, an English professor at Queen's College, argues that science fiction depicts things that are non-imaginary yet cognitively estranging, or events such as trauma that are so overwhelming that they escape immediate experience. I think that we can often say the same thing about fantasy novels. And in Borderline, Mishell ingeniously utilizes genre fiction to depict the creative process, the role of art and intimacy in the recovery from BPD, and the trauma consequent to a near-death suicide attempt. She has added to the conversation about BPD in such a unique way, and I was thrilled when she agreed to talk with me. So my first question is, why create a protagonist with BPD in a fantasy series? What was the inspiration or intention behind that?
It actually began with a slight misunderstanding that my husband had. He pitched me an idea because he knew that I like to write and read fantasy, and he likes pitching ideas. Right. And he said, what if there was an organization that was meant to sort of police traffic between here and some other alternate fantasy kind of world, but everybody who worked there had mental illness because it made them more sensitive to, otherworldly stuff. And I kind of had to stop there, and I was like, okay, I've never liked that trope that mental illness was some kind of like weird otherworldly superpower or something. No,
right. Yeah.
It's just another annoying thing that some people have to deal with.
Yeah.
Right. But I kind of couldn't get the idea out of my head. And then the next thing I thought was, actually, there's another very good reason why an organization like that might seek out people who had mental health difficulties. And it might be a bit too much of a spoiler to go into what that reason was,
right.
But his misunderstanding caused me to kind of turn it over in my head and think, well, actually, why would an organization seek out people with mental health issues, and what would that look like if they were all working together?
Yeah, and the answer, I won't spoil it either, but it's pretty dark.
Yeah, it's very dark.
But it makes
but it's
sense.
Also, but it's something that I wanted to express because it was something that, to a lesser extent, I've experienced in my own life, in the way that people deal with you when they know that you have some kind of mental illness. And I wanted to make people aware of it. And I think sometimes the best way to help people who don't have mental illnesses to sympathize and empathize with people who do is to tell it in just kind of an escapist story, that they're not really going into it to learn anything. People often close themselves off. If this is a documentary, if this is something where they're supposed to be learning, they might kind of push back. They feel like they know everything. But if you just say, hey, I'm going to tell you a story, I'm going to entertain you, I'm going to make your commute to work a little more interesting, they kind of let down their guard, and you can sneak in a little bit of information while they're having a good time.
Yeah, and you managed to elegantly sneak in a lot of information
I
about
hope so.
DBT, about DBT, dialectical behavior therapy, all kinds of things.
Yeah, that was very important to me. There were just things that I wanted people to know who didn't necessarily think they needed or wanted to learn it. I wanted to find a way to kind of just generally raise the level of awareness and understanding of mostly BPD, but also other kinds of mental illnesses among people who weren't even maybe looking for that information, who just wanted a nice story about fairies in Hollywood.
Exactly. Well, we see this all the time or I should say, these days, we see this quite a bit in children's books too. You're learning about some pretty serious, heavy topics, but in the form of a children's book. So, and I always liked that way of kind of introducing information. And like with BPD, there's a book called Millie the Cat Has Borderline Personality Disorder by Jessie Shepard, whom I interviewed. And that was something she created because she wanted to get clear, positive sounding information to her patients, You also make Millie, the main character, Millie Roper, physically disabled with a prosthetic leg. This is the result of a suicide attempt that predates the action in the book. It sounds like a premise for a really miserable story, and it's not at all. It's interesting to me that when we start the novel, Millie is actually coping with her physical disability pretty well. She struggles and there's discomfort, there's pain. She can't, run around Hollywood lots without trouble as she does at one point. But there's the real sense that the BPD is actually the greater challenge here, which I thought was interesting, or at least as great a challenge. Why give her this backstory and this disability? Was it important to show the intersection of BPD with a more physical challenge, or was there something else?
I have been asked this in interviews before, and so luckily I have the answer ready, but it's a bit of a dark one, but it is unfortunately true. As soon as I realized that she needed to be the survivor of a suicide attempt, I had to take into account the average person's attitude about people, especially women who survive suicide attempts. And there is a very common perception of women, especially women with BPD, that they're attention seekers and that any suicide attempt is really just an attempt to get attention and is not actually meant to harm oneself or to remove oneself from the world. And so I found myself realizing that if I was going to have any chance of a neurotypical person caring at all about a woman who had attempted to kill herself and had survived, that I was going to have to make it so obvious that she had intended to succeed. That she had to have done something that it was a miracle she survived. And that left me with either firearms, which I did not want to get into for my own reasons. I'm not comfortable with firearms at all.
Understood.
Or it had to be like a 7-story fall, that she just happened to land just the right way, that, her legs acted as like a crumple zone on a car and saved the rest of her. So it wasn't so much that I wished to write about someone with a physical disability. It was that I realized she was going to have one. And then it was on me to do the research to make that, to treat that with proper respect and to do it as well as I could as someone without personal experience. I will admit that, I do have slightly more reservations about the fact that I was writing about a disability that I have not personally experienced. I always feel a little uncomfortable trying to portray something that I'm not personally familiar with, but I've been told that, I handled it reasonably well for someone who doesn't have personal experience with it. I did speak with people and do a lot of research online, and I did my best. But it was a necessity because I needed to have a clear sign that it was not her just faking it for attention, because that's unfortunately a neurotypical perception of especially the intense emotions they assume, because they don't feel emotions on that level, that it must be a performance. And I needed to make sure that we knew that her suicide attempt was not performative, that she was in such a desperate state that she had decided to delete herself from existence, and she had done her best effort and had simply failed at it, luckily for her and everyone that she meets.
Absolutely. I wasn't expecting that answer. I don't know what I really expected, but I completely understand where you're coming from.
Yeah.
And it's interesting because I was actually writing about this book yesterday because I'm working on a book about BPD. And I was talking about what I saw as you're taking on those comments about suicide being attention seeking, kind of taking
Mm.
them and refracting them through Millie, because you have this beautiful line in the book where Millie is thinking about the suicide attempt, and she says, she thinks to herself, suicide is not a way of ending pain. It's just a way of redistributing it. So not only do you show that this was not an attention-seeking act, that was someone who wanted to die. You don't
Yeah.
jump off a seven-story building. But she's also someone who has empathy and who realized that
Yeah.
even whatever her intention was, however intense her pain was, yeah, it's not a way of ending pain because you do want to end the pain, but it hurts other people. So I think that's such a beautiful thing you do with that.
Yeah, the side effect of her fortunate survival is that she got to see the aftermath and how it affected
Right,
people, that there were people who had to be there on the scene and
right,
take care of her. And whether she had survived or not, they still would have witnessed that, been affected
right.
by that. And it's only when you get past that sense of urgency, I must just do something now to make this pain stop. Once you get past that sense of urgency and you see the long-term effects of things, that's where you
Mhm.
can really learn from it. And that's why it's so fortunate that this character was able to survive and look back and see, wow, that split-second decision I made had so many repercussions for so many people. And yeah, I'm glad that you liked that line because it was one of those things that when I forget everything else about the book, I remember that sentence because
Yeah,
it's one of the most important things I wanted to get across in the story
right.
is that
Yeah.
suicide is not an end of anything. It's someone else's backstory.
It just took my breath away. And I think it's so crucial to her character because Millie at the start, especially, is really hard on herself. And she does
Mm,
have kind of a caustic way of going through the world. But I think she's really trying. And in those moments like that, you see the glimpses of just the goodness in her.
yeah.
Related to all of this, being hyper aware of how neurotypical people might react to Millie, I'm wondering what the hardest thing about representing BPD in this book was. Like at one point in the book, Millie says to someone, you know just enough about BPD to be really unhelpful. And I think, which is great because that's like 90% of what you read in a Google search on BPD
Yes.
is like just enough.
Yes.
So, how to avoid that kind of trap of, or not sharing enough to be helpful? Like, what was really hard in representing Millie beyond the previous suicide attempt?
I think the hardest part about writing about BPD for me, I actually managed to cleverly evade. The hardest part is hearing neurotypical people's reaction and
Yeah.
criticisms. Oh, she was so intolerable. It was a good story despite what a horrible person the main character is.
Right.
And I avoided that by not reading my reviews,
Mm.
other than the reviews that my publisher specifically sent me, the
Right.
starred Publishers Weekly reviews and stuff like
Right.
that she sent me. It was like, you must read this. I did not read a single review, good or bad, because as someone who has emotional regulation difficulties, the kind of criticisms that would have hit me very personally, they could have set me back in my own mental health journey quite a bit. Reading constant criticisms of the character that were based on things she couldn't help, right? Like her emotional
Yeah.
dysregulation. A lot of people see that as a character flaw and speak of it
Yes.
that way. So that would have been the most difficult aspect of writing about it if I had allowed that into my space. But I
Yeah.
decided reviews are for readers anyway. They're not for the author. The book is already out there. It's not criticism that
Mhm.
can make me improve the book. The book is finished. Reviews are for other readers so they know
Mhm.
what to read. So I don't believe that authors really ever need to read the reviews at all. In some blog post of mine a while back, I said, good reviews go to my head and bad ones go to my heart, and neither one of them
Yeah.
helps me become a better writer.
I absolutely agree with that. I have a hard time reading the comments section of someone else's work about BPD.
Yeah.
I mean, those can really trigger me. I had an article that my literary agent sent me a few months ago that was in the New York Times, and I don't know why I did it. It was about a marathon runner with BPD, and I looked at the comment section, and it was just, everything we've come to expect,
Oh
really
my
awful
God.
stuff
A
about it.
terrible anecdote along those lines, and you can feel free to edit it out if it's too terrible. But
No,
when I used to be
probably not.
on Twitter, back when Twitter was a thing and not quite as much of a dumpster fire, I
Yeah.
had a Twitter account with about 7 or 8 thousand followers, I think. And some of them were people that I talked to back and forth daily. But one of them somehow managed not to know that I had BPD. And I happened to tweet something about how I'd been talking another friend down who was dealing with a BPD flare up situation. And this person replied to me, just stay away from anyone with BPD. Those people are
Mhm.
toxic and cannot be helped.
Which is completely untrue on so many
And I
levels.
replied
Yeah,
to him, I guess you're not aware that I also have BPD, but I'm now aware of something about you that
right.
I'm glad that I know. So that was the end of my internet friendship with that individual. But yeah,
Yeah,
the fact that someone could think they know everything about how people with BPD are and not know that I had BPD and think that they knew
right.
me well, like those two things do not compute together.
Yeah, absolutely. And I do think that's always a risk about writing something about BPD. Like, what are people going to say?
It
Because it's
was
so easy to attack us.
It was difficult when I realized the book had sold and was going to be published. I had a
Yeah,
decision to make. Am I going to be
right.
open about having BPD? There were drawbacks either way. I was going to get criticism either way. I was either going to get criticism for having BPD or get criticism for writing about it
Exactly.
when it wasn't
Yeah.
my lived experience. And I
Although, like
thought,
I told you before we started recording, I was thinking as I read the book before I saw your post about having BPD, this author is incredible if she doesn't have it because she's got everything right. So that, I don't know, maybe they
yeah.
would have been blown away, but
And I do think it is possible to write very respectfully and well about something that isn't
Mhm.
your own lived experience if you do a lot of research and you're very
Right.
empathetic and respectful. But at the time, I had a lot of decisions to make as a new author, and that was one that
Mhm.
I just fell on the side of, okay, I would rather take some flack for something that's true than for something that's not. Accused of being mentally ill, because I
Right.
am, than be
Right.
accused of making up stuff about something that I have no right to
Right.
talk about, because that's not true. I have every right in the world to talk about at least one experience.
I think that's such a gift to people too, because people who have BPD can see this representation and know that you really understand what they're going through. And I also think it's pretty important with BPD to share our successes, whatever they
Yeah.
are. When I've talked about getting a doctorate with BPD, because I think there's so much negativity surrounding the
Yes.
diagnosis that they think, oh, I can't go out and write a book, or I
Yeah,
can't go
I'll
out.
never have a life.
Right.
And it's,
You're
it's right
disproving this.
there on my website, not only that I'm an author of 3 books that have been long listed for various
Yeah,
awards,
amazing awards.
but
Yeah.
also that I have a husband and 2 kids and that
Hmm.
I have a house in
Right.
California. These are
Yeah,
not the trappings of a life of someone whose life was ruined. I know I made
absolutely.
many bad detours along the way to
Yeah.
getting, but that's one of the things that I tried to put into these books is that you can make mistakes. You can blow up your
Yeah.
life repeatedly. You can blow up your life a dozen times
Yep.
and start over.
Yeah.
And everyone with BPD is raising their hand right
Yeah.
now going, yep. This is
I
my
just did.
my third time
Mhm.
blowing up my life, my fifth time, my 12th time, depending on how old you are. But honestly, if you can make it to your 30s, your 40s, your 50s, just survive, basically.
Yeah.
If nothing else, if just survive, you start to get enough perspective that it
Yeah.
all starts to kind of even out a little bit and you start to be able to build things and you
Right.
start having those long-term relationships and those
Yeah.
long-term projects that are impossible in your 20s. Or for me, I
Yeah.
dropped out of college like 3 times.
I still dropped off, took time out. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
It's really hard to have that
Yeah,
consistency.
but the longer you can survive, the more you learn, and the better the next iteration of your
Yeah.
rising from the ashes,
Yeah,
it
definitely.
it just gets better every time.
Yeah, I think that's really true. You mentioned that there are other mental illnesses that you're writing about in the book. Did you do any particular research for
A
that for
little
that?
bit. A little bit. I didn't research them as intricately as I did the physical disability because it's all very narrow. Her point of view is okay if I didn't get everything just right because
Right.
she's going to be wrong about things. She's wrong about a lot of stuff. She's a very
Right.
unreliable narrator in a lot of
Yeah.
ways. But I wanted to make sure that at least things that were said by the characters or by characters who would know better, I need to make sure those are reasonably accurate. But
Yeah.
there may be some mistakes here and there. But
Mhm.
also, I do know a lot of people who have varying mental
Right.
illnesses, both
Yeah.
in my family and also just in my friend group, because, we tend to flock together a little
Hmm.
bit
We do. Yeah.
because we understand.
I love that you have these concrete metaphors for things like with Carol, who has
Mm,
sort of a dragon that kind of seems to be a manifestation of her PTSD, taking mental illness and making it into this almost kind of an allegory, but of
mm.
this fantastical representation of
Yeah.
pain and trauma and torment, I think is so special.
That was fun for me because a lot of times we see fantasy use mental illness only as an allegory, only symbolically. It's
Right.
demon possession,
Yes.
and so I thought it was kind of fun for me to say, well, here's the metaphor, but also here's the real thing right next to it.
Well, and also it's kind of an allegory of coping,
Yeah.
not just a fantasy of how you could cope. I'd love to have my own dragon around, I could definitely use one. So, and I read in one interview where you commented that one thing you really like in the book is this atmosphere of eroticism, which I definitely appreciated as well. And
Mm.
again, I've only read the first one, Borderline, so far. So I'm wondering, what is Millie's relationship to her sexuality at the start of the series? A big part of why I'm asking is because the borderline woman is so often troped as hypersexual or,
Right.
promiscuous. So I'm wondering if you were thinking about that and kind of working within that, like, how do I create a sexual character who isn't doing this kind of cliched idea of it, like just sleeping around with
Right.
everyone or.
Yeah. It was a complicated thing for me because my own sexuality is actually somewhere on the asexual spectrum. I have never really nailed it down precisely because there's so many different variations of what sexuality can be. I could easily forget that sex exists for months at a time.
Mhm.
It's not like a huge priority for me. Ironically, it was the subgenre I found myself writing in that necessitated me, okay, here I need to focus on this subject, this mood, this idea, because urban fantasy in general is a very sexy genre. I had not read a lot of urban fantasy before writing this. Then, after I wrote the first draft, I realized what it was. I did research and I was like, this needs
Right.
more sex in it. I'm going to have to put more sex in it. But I do have some thoughts on the relationship between BPD and sexuality because in my more symptomatic years, let's say,
Mhm.
I was much more sexually active. And
Right.
I think it's because, and I think I even say this verbatim in the book somewhere, but it's tied to survival for women. Women are largely, unfortunately, in a patriarchal society. We are seen as sex objects. Our
Yeah.
value is equated to how sexy we are, how sexually
Right.
attractive we are. A woman who is not sexually attractive is seen as more or less worthless
Right.
in the US at least and in
Yeah.
Western culture. And so I think someone with BPD like Millie or like me when I was younger realizes I'm going to be hard to like because of my emotions. So
Right.
I'd better be pretty dang sexy.
Yeah.
If anybody's going to stick around, they got to be
Mhm.
just utterly enticed by my
Right.
sexual charisma, right?
Yeah.
And so I think that is why people even and I think it's very telling that someone who naturally falls into more like the demisexual or asexual spectrum, that I
Yeah.
was so hypersexual in my 20s despite my natural tendencies because it was sheer survival. I was going to
Yeah.
be alone if I couldn't
Mhm.
figure out how to be seen as this siren, this
Right.
seductive, irresistible creature. And I think a lot of women, especially with BPD, feel that pressure to be the irresistible siren that people just keep coming back to, even if they're a little difficult sometimes to
Right.
talk to. Like there
Yeah.
has to be something that keeps that man in your life. And it's
Absolutely.
sad. It's sad, but I think it's something that's probably very common among women with BPD.
Yeah.
Coping mechanisms may vary, but that's a very common coping mechanism, I think.
And it made it so hard for me for so many years to understand what was my desire like really.
Yeah.
Who did I want? What did I want? How often did I want those kinds of things? And now I've been married for my second marriage, but this one has stuck, but it for almost 15 years, and it's still something I'm exploring. But I think it's a much more positive place now. But when you're younger, it can be a temptation. That's how you connect with people, and like you
Yeah.
say, try to keep them. But it's interesting that you knew that for the urban fantasy genre, you needed that kind of
Yeah.
erotic crackle. I haven't
Hmm.
read much urban fantasy at all, but I saw that Charlaine Harris blurbed your
Uh-huh.
book, and
Yeah.
I did read her The Southern Vampire Chronicles. I think
Yeah.
the Sookie Stackhouse books. If
Yeah. Hmm.
anyone, I was living in Poland, and they had hardly any books in English at the bookstore, so I thought I'll try them, and they're really fun.
Yeah,
And
I was
but yeah, there's a
delighted
lot of
that
sex.
she read and liked my book. But yeah, most urban fantasy has way more sex than
Yeah,
Borderline does. But by the nature of the time frame of the storyline, that Millie is only dealing with
right.
people that she's known for a week or less, I
Yeah,
thought she cannot actually have sex in this book, or
right,
we're dealing with another symptom she's exhibiting, because most people don't just
right,
jump in bed with someone they've known a week, especially someone
right,
who's a coworker. So there was just no one that she could like realistically and healthily have sex
right,
with. And I didn't want to give her any more problems. So I tried to make it as sexy as I could without having her
right.
actually jump in bed with someone.
Yeah, no, I think it is there because there's longing. You said that you only realized it was urban fantasy after the first draft. Were you just thinking of it as general fantasy,
Yeah.
or was that, and just related to that, did you choose fantasy because you thought it might allow you to say something different
I
about
chose
BPD or?
I chose fantasy because I'm obsessed with fantasy. It's all I've ever
Mhm.
read or written. Games I play are all set in kind of a fantasy
Right.
milieu. I've always loved stuff like Dungeons and Dragons, like
Hmm.
fantasy role-playing
My
games,
husband
video
does
games,
too.
that kind of
Yeah.
thing. I've always loved that since I was a kid. It's been
Hmm.
my number one favorite thing. And so my goal was always to write what we call secondary world fantasy, which is, like Lord of the Rings. It takes place somewhere
Right.
else, right?
Yeah.
A fantasy world. That was what I was always doing all my life. But that stuff requires so much detail, research. You have to know
Yeah.
politics, sociology, architecture. You have to know so
Right.
much stuff to make it work. And
Yeah.
I was tired. I had a new baby. I had
Yeah.
BPD. I had
Yeah, that's a
BPD and a
lot.
6-month-old baby. I was not going to be writing secondary world fantasy. So I was like, okay, but it's got to have magic or fairies or something in it. But I'll just have it here in LA. And
Right.
then so I reinvented the wheel and reinvented urban fantasy. So after I wrote the first draft of it and realized what I'd done, I was like, okay, I have to actually see what other people are doing in this
Right.
subgenre so that I can make it fit. So
Right.
I had to add a little more sex. And I think that's pretty much all I needed to do, because I instinctively did some of the urban fantasy stuff, like the first person viewpoint and the
Right.
kind of noir
Yeah.
vibe apparently is a really common urban fantasy thing. And this is the thing about genres and subgenres. They aren't created by the marketplace artificially. They organically evolve because they
Right.
just make sense somehow. And the
Yeah.
fact that I accidentally wrote an urban fantasy that was almost spot on everything it needed to be,
Right.
I think that suggests that that category is just a valid organic thing, that
Yeah.
emerged on its own.
I love this setting. I lived for over a decade in the Bay Area because I
Mm,
went to grad school at Berkeley, and but I would visit friends and go to LA for other purposes as well, and I always loved it down there. So
yeah,
it's and everything, the idea of Hollywood as glamorous, and of course
yeah,
glamour being
hmm,
related to that witchcraft magic is
yeah,
wonderful. And I love the idea of the echoes, the kind of muses that
hmm,
these A-list creative types
yeah.
have. You said that you don't read reviews outside of what your publisher sends, but did you hear from any readers, any reactions that were positive, that were really important to you?
Oh God, yes. I had no idea what I had done. My goal when I wrote the book was I want to make people miss their subway stop, that
Right.
I just and read in one sitting, And I did achieve that. I've heard that a lot, but what I was not expecting was I have literally got more than 20 letters, some of them
Mhm.
handwritten from
Mhm.
people with
Yeah.
BPD
Mhm.
telling me that I had saved their lives.
Wow.
I have heard that. I have heard that now upwards of 20 times. There are 20
Mhm.
lives that, at least by their own assertion, have been
Yeah.
saved by me which is not anything that I ever expected. You know what, and many of your listeners know what it's like having BPD and feeling so many times so absolutely worthless
Yeah.
that the idea that I could have saved 20 or more lives, and these are just the ones who wrote to me.
Right. Oh,
And
yeah.
for everyone that wrote, there were some that just
Yes.
quietly had this thought, maybe I could be something. Maybe I don't have to absolutely hate myself. Maybe I could be a
Yeah.
hero in some weird way. Maybe there's
Right.
some place that I will fit just right if I just hang on long enough,
Right.
because they read this story where someone saw the moment they were sure their life was over, and then they somehow lived past it and realized
Yeah.
there was more life after it.
Right.
And just that being immersed in that story can be enough to save somebody. And I didn't know that at the time I was writing. And I'm glad that I didn't know, or I never would have had the courage
Right.
to finish the book. I would have tied myself in mental knots,
Right.
worrying about the impact I was going to have. But I thought I was just writing a fun little
Right.
adventure, funny, dark, maybe
Yeah.
touching some dark stuff. But I didn't think that it could be that profound, because I had underestimated what it feels like to see yourself in fiction as the hero when you never have
Right.
before.
It's impressive enough to be shortlisted for the Nebula and World Fantasy Prize and all that, but that
That
is
felt
it.
great. Yeah.
That you're right, I'm sure. But
But trade
people
all of
say
that.
that you're right, that you saved their lives. I can see it. She does become a heroic character, even in
Yeah.
this first book, and I imagine that continues. And I like the idea that she's finding a place for
Yeah.
herself, and her life continued past where she thought it would, and
Yeah.
she's grateful about it most of the
Yeah.
time. There are some hard moments in the book, but that is really amazing. Did you want the book to be therapeutic? Was that something you thought about consciously
Didn't
at
even occur
all?
to me. Didn't even occur to me because, again, this is pretty common among people with BPD, but I never saw myself as someone who would matter at all to anyone else.
Yeah,
So all of the thoughts that went into writing the first book were all just about what I wanted to write,
right.
the story I wanted to tell, just to get it out of me, the things I
Mhm.
wanted to say, the things I wanted to invent and imagine. That was all I was thinking of, was this is for me. This is all
Mhm.
for me. So I can become an author, so I can
Right,
finally write a story that everyone will love, and they'll buy it. Maybe they'll nominate me for some awards or something when I'm really
right.
dreaming big. And
They
that was
sure
all I
did.
was thinking about. It was all
Mhm.
entirely selfish, and it wasn't until after the book came out, and because of the way the publishing schedule works, I was heavily into writing the next books before
Right,
the first one even was on shelves.
right.
So I didn't really see the impact until I had already really done so much writing. And again, I can only say I'm glad I didn't know, because it's like asking the bumblebee how it flies.
Mhm.
I might have
Yeah.
crashed. I barely finished the third book as it was, because BPD, I had a major BPD relapse while writing
Oh,
the third
wow.
one, and it was six
Mhm.
months late. And if you ever get to read the second and third book, there's notes at the end of it that talks a little bit about what happened
Mhm.
as I was writing the third book. And I wouldn't have even gotten that far if I'd had any idea how important the book would be to certain people.
Yeah.
I just thought of myself as this very unimportant person who was just desperately trying to get 15 minutes of fame, and that was all it was.
So you were telling such a personal experience that a lot of people could relate to. I think we often have to get to that universal quality through something intensely personal like that.
Yeah,
And it's obvious that a lot of honesty must have
yeah,
gone into this
yeah,
book. There's one part where Millie is talking about remorse, and she says, remorse is not something anyone feels easily. At heart, it comes from the recognition that you've done something beneath your worth. From a Borderline's perspective, nothing is beneath her worth because she has no worth.
yeah.
It captures exactly how we think,
Mm.
which is so convoluted and probably beyond comprehension to a lot of people. But I think with being in Millie's head throughout the book, by the end, even people who don't have the experience of BPD have at least a little taste of how it feels to be in that kind of maelstrom of conflicting
I've
emotions and sensations.
Yeah, I've gotten some feedback along those lines too. I've had people write me and say, "Thank you. I finally understand my sister. I finally understand my mom."
Hmm.
And that was also, while not as profound as finding out that I had saved someone's life,
Right.
to find out I'd saved a relationship, maybe.
I was going to
Also
say,
very
yeah,
cool. So all this stuff, I thought my mom was just being a jerk, but now I
right.
see what she was suffering.
And it's so
And
layered, all the thought
yeah, and I
processes.
understand she didn't mean this the way I took it.
Right.
I see now maybe kind of what she was going through and why she said those things, and it had nothing to do with really even being angry at me, you know.
Hmm.
And it's hard growing up with a borderline parent. It's hard
Yeah,
dating someone with BPD, but if you understand what's going on with them, you can make it easier not only for them but for yourself.
right. And we're living in a time where they now have support groups for
Yep.
family members, partners.
Yep.
I think that's a big step forward as well.
Mhm.
I have two more questions. One is that I read that you love Vladimir Nabokov, who's a favorite of
Oh,
mine as well. So,
yes.
yeah, how does he influence your writing?
Oh, I wish he influenced my writing. My writing would be so much better if he actually
You have some
influenced.
beautiful passages here. Don't listen to her if you.
I aspire to just his pure lyricism, and I think it comes from being trilingual.
Yeah,
You know, he was fluent in English, French, and Russian, and
right. And may have even learned to read English before any other language because of his
yeah.
governess. Sometimes people say, well, how could he write in English when that wasn't his native language?
Mm.
It almost was, but I think like I agree, it's this combination, the multilingual and the
Yeah, and
fluency.
knowing more than one language, you have them all rattling around in your head. And so when he's thinking of ways to describe things, he will think not
Yeah,
only of the English cliches, but now we've got Russian expressions and French expressions, and they all kind of jumble together in your head and you come up with these weird hybrid ways of describing things. And that's the only way I can explain how it is that Nabokov describes things in ways that are both very weird and jarring, and these are not the words that any other author would use, and that at the same time you go, yes, that is
right.
exactly it. I never would have used those words, but
Mhm.
yes. And
Yeah,
that's what I love about him.
it's almost fantastical and down to earth at the same time. Some of
Yeah.
his turns of phrases, I agree.
Pale Fire is my desert island book. If there was only one book that I could have on a desert island,
Mhm.
that's the one because I could read it hundreds of times and
Right.
just get something different out of it every time.
Oh,
Oh,
absolutely.
I've talked to people, very intelligent people, literary critics, poets, who have failed to notice how deeply compassionate a book Pale Fire is. It is often described as being very cold and
Yeah, I've heard
detached.
that too.
And
Hmm.
yet, if you know what to look for, it is so deeply compassionate and emotional.
Hmm.
It takes your breath away.
I think
And I
there's a
was very glad finally when a literary scholar agreed with me that because the first person I talked to about it, they were like, I don't know how you got that out of that book. Were we reading the same book? But then finally I talked to another guy who had an advanced degree in English and he was like, oh, no, you were just doing the collegiate reading of this book. You saw the layers. So I was like, oh,
right.
thank you. Thank you.
Oh, yeah. I think there's a lot of warmth and decency in pretty much all his books, but
Yeah,
I
you
agree it's
can
there too.
tell he was a cranky old man who had a secret soft heart.
Right.
I love that in a person. I think I would have gotten along with him very well if we'd ever had the
Yeah.
chance to meet.
Well, and we were talking about occasional suffering before we
Hmm.
started
Hmm.
recording. And you think about that in the context of someone like Nabokov, who had this idyllic childhood and then it was all taken away from him by
Yeah,
the Russian Revolution. And I imagine that always impacted his work, that loss, exile, as it does with
absolutely.
so many authors who go through that. How do you feel about occasional suffering in your life and work?
I think it is a gift.
Mhm.
Not while you're in it, but the classic example is that I'm on a chemotherapy regimen, palliative chemo, because there's the type of cancer I have is not curable. So every other Monday, I go in and I get chemo. I get hooked up to a pump that I'm on for 2 days, and then they unhook the pump 2 days later, and I get it out of my system a little bit.
Yeah,
And usually by the second week, I'm feeling pretty normal. And
right,
then they hook me up to the pump again the next Monday. So literally every other Monday, I go through from 2 to 5 days, depending on the cycle,
right.
of just feeling miserable, like the worst flu you've ever had. And then I go back to feeling normal, neutral, right?
Right.
Which should be normal and neutral, except that I'm ecstatic now. I am
Yeah.
ecstatic that I want to eat 3 meals a day and that food is
Mhm.
enjoyable. I'm ecstatic that I can walk for a mile on the treadmill and feel fine. And these things are just a sudden source of absolute bliss that if I hadn't had the experience of suffering for
Right.
4 days previous to that, they would have just been, oh, it's just a Tuesday. This is just normal and just take it for granted. And
Yeah.
I think that is true of everything in life. And one of the most beautiful things about people with BPD that never gets a lot of press is that yes, it is an emotional regulation disorder, which means that when you feel angry, when you feel sad, it's 10 times the intensity that
Mhm.
most other people feel. But the same with happiness,
Yes.
with love, with
Yeah.
finding something funny. It's the funniest thing you've ever heard in your life. And when
Mhm.
you're delighted by a gift that someone gives you, you're over the moon and
Yes.
you appreciate it so much more than your average person who has, I've been taking a lot of math classes, and so I'm thinking in terms of like a sine wave on a graph and the amplitude of it. The peaks are higher, the valleys are lower. But some people, their lines are just almost flat and they have such a small, and that makes a more
Yeah.
stable life, and it makes for less crisis.
Yeah.
But man, I would never trade away the absolute bliss that I can feel on a good day. It is possible, and I'm just going to tell this to anybody out there who's kind of like just starting on their whole BPD therapy journey or whatever. When you learn to use the tools really well, you can cheat and you can start to even out the valleys without
Mhm.
getting rid of the peaks. So you
Right.
get it's almost like cheating. You can fail to regulate your happiness. You can let that stay as over the top as you want
Yeah.
while you even out your rage and your despair and your panic and your
Hmm.
anxiety. But you don't have to, so unlike, sometimes certain medications are meant to just kind of even everything out. But when you do the therapy and you use the tools, you can just even out the one side. And that's kind of
Right.
where I've found myself now in my late 40s. I have cancer. I have terminal cancer. Like my
Yeah.
lifespan is anywhere from 3 months to 3 years. We don't know. And
Yeah.
yet I am happier most days than most people I know. And it's because of
Mhm.
having BPD and going through all the therapy and learning these like mental hacks to
Right.
manipulate my own emotions. I've learned how to defuse those negative emotions so well that even when they're about something like cancer or about impending death, I can still use the same tools and just be like, I don't have to make my whole life about this. I can
Right.
turn my mental camera toward, well, right now I have this amazing cheeseburger in front of me that tastes so good.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, the tools that you use for BPD, I wish everyone had those tools. I wish everyone had to go through a course of DBT and
Yeah.
mindfulness, and
Mindfulness, I think, is probably the single most important thing you
it
can
is. It has
learn.
changed my life. I'm so different from the person I was in my 20s that people who knew me then, it's awkward for me to be around them because
Yeah.
I feel like they're talking to a ghost. I don't know that person anymore. I'm so much happier and just generally more serene with a lot more obstacles and problems in my life. I have teenage children and terminal cancer and I should be miserable. And yet here I am because of everything that I learned in my therapy.
Hmm.
Most days I am just happier than anyone I know.
That's beautiful, though I'm sure anyone listening would agree with me that it does seem really unfair that you saved people's lives and now you're going through this thing that is,
Well, here's the thing, everyone dies at some point,
and we do. Yeah.
and so it's about what kind of life did you live? And I've just said gotten letters from people that said I say like,
Yeah.
who gets to have that even if they live 80,
Mhm.
90, 150 years?
Yeah.
Who gets to be as happy as I've felt? So I don't feel that it's unfair. I'm open for a miracle that I live another 2 years and then 2 years later they find a new treatment
Right. You
and
never
I
know
get to
the
live another, yeah, who
unexplored.
knows? So
Yeah.
I'm open to whatever, but even if I die before the end of the year or something, I don't feel cheated. I've done more and lived more and felt more. My life could have ended in my early 30s, but it's different knowing now that I have lived the life that I was allotted to live. I did not cut it short myself. I have
Yes.
gotten everything out
I
of my
feel that
life
too.
that I could. And so there's a difference between an early death that's by your own hand and an early death that's by natural causes, because there is some part of me, and maybe it's the a little bit of mysticism or woo woo, whatever thinking I have, is that if natural causes are taking me, that means that my work here is done. But if you make that decision in a moment of
Mhm.
despair, you don't know what would have happened tomorrow.
Yeah, you might not get to go on to
Yeah,
save
you
other
don't
people, you
exactly.
know?
You don't know if your work was done. You're in a terrible mood. You're not thinking straight, or you wouldn't be
Yeah.
doing this.
No, you're not thinking straight at all in
Yeah.
those moments, I know. Yeah.
Yeah, and so at least now I know that I'm clear-headed. If my life ends, it's not because I made a mistake.
That's so beautiful. I think that's a really good note to end on. Thank you so much. It was so moving and incredible to talk to you. I really
Well, thank you
enjoyed
for
that.
having me. It's been a while since I've done an interview and I enjoy them. And I hope that you get a chance to check out the other books too, because I
I
think
absolutely will.
a lot of what you liked about her journey continues and develops even more, and I think you'll really enjoy it.
I'm sure I will. I highly, highly, highly recommend these books. Please buy Mishell Baker's book, the Arcadia Project trilogy. So thanks so much.